Hey guys, tonight we are traveling far north to a windswept island in the North Atlantic where the winters bite hard, the sheep look judgmental, and the people somehow manage to run an entire society without writing down a single law for centuries. That's right, we're in medieval Iceland, where rules weren't tucked into dusty tomes but lodged inside human memory. Imagine trying to remember not just your shopping list, but the entire legal code of a country. You probably won't survive this, unless your idea of fun is becoming a walking library with a fur cloak. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening right now, I'd love for you to drop your location and local time in the comments. It's oddly soothing to know who's tuning in at midnight in Reykjavik or at 3 a.m. in Melbourne. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing you notice about Iceland in the Middle Ages is the isolation. The sea stretches endlessly, gray and restless, dotted with seabirds. Inland, jagged lava fields and mossy hills make travel difficult, while long winters demand endurance. And yet, despite the harsh environment, the island teems with human stories. Families carving farms from rocky soil, ships braving icy waters, and laws, yes, laws, circulating not on parchment, but on tongues and in memory. One mainstream fact: when Iceland was settled around the late 9th century, its people brought with them traditions from Norway and other Scandinavian homelands. But unlike much of Europe, Iceland had no king, no centralized authority, and crucially, no early widespread writing system for legal documents. Instead, society relied on spoken words. Rules were carried in the minds of chieftains and ordinary folk alike, repeated at assemblies, argued over at farmhouses, and preserved by custom. In a place where literacy was rare and parchment expensive, the human voice became both archive and authority. Quirky tidbit: the very landscape played a role. Certain rocks, hills, and valleys became natural filing cabinets, where people gathered to speak and remember. The law rock at Thingvellir, for instance, wasn't just a scenic boulder. It was the literal platform from which laws were recited. Imagine a giant hard drive made of basalt, storing nothing but human voices year after year. Historians still argue whether Icelanders avoided writing laws out of necessity, lacking materials and scribes, or out of principle, believing that spoken law was more flexible, living, and communal. Was it poverty of parchment or pride in memory? The debate remains, echoing like the wind across the fjords. As you stand on that windy ground, the cold nipping your ears, you realize the silence is deceiving. Beneath it lies a chorus of remembered words, rules carried in the heads of farmers, warriors, and poets. The island may look barren, but its people are brimming with law, not written in ink, but etched in memory. The sea wind follows you inland, across rocky fields until you hear the rising murmur of voices. Ahead lies Thingvellir, the gathering place of Iceland's great assembly, the Althing. You step into a valley where cliffs frame a natural stage, streams glisten in the sun, and hundreds of people mill about in cloaks and woolen hoods. It is summer, the only season when Icelanders can travel easily, and they've come from across the island to argue, to feast, to trade, and most of all, to remember. One mainstream fact: the Althing, founded around 930 CE, is often called the world's oldest functioning parliament. Here, Icelanders from scattered farms and districts met annually to settle disputes, pass judgments, and ensure the legal memory was kept alive. Unlike stone halls in Europe, this assembly was outdoors, held in the shadow of lava cliffs and beside the law rock. The atmosphere is less solemn court and more festival. Tents dot the grassy plain, bright with woven cloth, filled with the smell of smoked lamb, and echoing with laughter. Traders spread out goods: carved walrus ivory, imported fabrics, dried fish. Children chase each other between campfires, while skalds, poets, recite sagas late into the night. In the middle of this hubbub, law and memory are the heartbeat. You walk among chieftains called godar, their cloaks fastened with silver brooches. Each represents a district, bringing their followers and their knowledge of the law. Disputes are prepared like theater pieces. One man claims his neighbor stole sheep, the neighbor insists otherwise, and both prepare to cite remembered laws like lawyers rehearsing lines. Quirky tidbit: people also treated the Althing as a matchmaking fair. With so many families gathered, alliances were sealed over bowls of ale. Imagine attending court to argue about grazing rights, only to leave with a new son-in-law. Historians still argue whether the Althing was primarily a court, a legislature, or a social gathering that happened to include law. Some scholars emphasize its legal rigor. Others see it as a grand meeting where stories, trade, and politics mattered just as much as rules. The truth probably lies in its blend. Law braided into daily life, inseparable from feasting and gossip. At the center of it all is the Logberg, the Law Rock. This natural platform rises above the crowd, a stage where the Lawspeaker will stand, projecting his voice across the assembly. You can almost feel the anticipation ripple outward, everyone waiting for the moment when memory transforms into public truth. The valley hums with voices, but when the Lawspeaker ascends, silence spreads like frost over the crowd. He lifts his hand, prepares to speak, and you realize you're standing in a place where law is not stored in scrolls or tablets, but in the fragile, powerful breath of one man. The crowd hushes as a single figure steps onto the Logberg, the Law Rock, his cloak snapping in the wind. This is the lögsögumaður, the Lawspeaker, the human archive of Iceland. You watch him steady himself, glance across the valley, and then open his mouth, not to improvise, not to entertain, but to recite the memory of an entire nation. One mainstream fact: the Lawspeaker was the highest legal authority in medieval Iceland, chosen to serve a 3-year term. His primary duty was to recite aloud 1/3 of the laws each summer at the Althing, ensuring that over 3 years the entire code was spoken and refreshed in collective memory. Without him, the law might wither into silence. His voice rolls across the plain, trained to carry through the open air. There are no microphones, no parchment notes, only rhythm and repetition. He begins with the most essential sections, the backbone of Icelandic governance. Farmers and chieftains listen closely, nodding, sometimes mouthing the words they already know. You realize this is less a performance and more a collective act of remembering. Quirky tidbit: law speakers were allowed to sit in a special seat during assemblies, a place of honor. But it also made them easy targets for heckling if they slipped up. Imagine trying to recall a 40-minute speech word for word outdoors, while half the audience is distracted by sheep bleating in the background. Historians still argue whether law speakers had the law perfectly memorized or whether they improvised certain details, filling in gaps with their own judgment. Some scholars believe their role was closer to a judge than a parrot, interpreting as well as recalling. Others insist the fidelity of oral tradition kept them remarkably accurate. The truth may be somewhere between, memory as framework, interpretation as glue. You watch the law speaker pause, breathe, then continue. His words are not rushed. They move with measured cadence, like waves hitting shore. The rhythm makes them easier to remember and easier for listeners to absorb. He invokes phrases that sound almost like poetry, patterned for the ear rather than the eye. This is law shaped not for parchment, but for the human tongue. The crowd absorbs every syllable. Farmers shift on their feet, murmuring agreement when a passage matches their recollection. Children fidget, only half aware they are hearing the constitution of their society. Chieftains exchange glances, calculating how certain phrases might help them in disputes later. You notice how memory here is not private property but communal, carried in many minds, refreshed by ritual repetition. The law speaker lowers his hand. A ripple passes through the assembly. Relief, satisfaction, perhaps even awe. For another year, the law has been spoken, and therefore the law exists. In this system, silence would be erasure. Words keep the nation alive. As you step back from the law rock, you feel both admiration and unease. Admiration for the sheer skill of one man holding such memory, and unease at how fragile it seems, how easily one slip of the tongue might bend justice. The crowd slowly disperses from the law rock, but the echo of the law speaker's voice lingers in your ears. You realize that this was not just ritual, it was government. In Iceland, memory itself became the machinery of order, the invisible parchment on which society was written. Tonight you trace how recitation took the place of bureaucracy, and how a nation trusted memory instead of ink. One mainstream fact: unlike monarchies with royal scribes, Iceland had no king and no permanent government offices in the early Middle Ages. Instead, authority lay in the Althing and in the spoken laws it preserved. If a law was not remembered, it effectively ceased to exist. If it was spoken, it held binding force. You walk among the tents, overhearing disputes that all circle back to memory. A farmer argues that grazing rights extend to a certain riverbank. His neighbor insists the boundary lies further inland. Both men begin quoting remembered phrases, summoning law not from a chest of scrolls but from their heads. It feels less like legal argument and more like a contest of storytellers. Whoever remembers best, or persuades most convincingly, wins. Quirky tidbit. Some Icelanders treated these recitations as entertainment. Just as we binge-watch courtroom dramas, they would gather to hear arguments over sheep theft or insults. The spectacle was less about solemn justice and more about enjoying the duel of memories, especially if the disputants added a touch of sarcasm or wit. Historians still argue whether this oral system created stability or fragility. Some point to Iceland's remarkable endurance as a self-governing society for centuries, proof that memory worked. Others argue that reliance on oral recall left laws dangerously open to manipulation, since forgetting or misphrasing could reshape outcomes. Was this democratic flexibility or just a loophole waiting to be exploited? You imagine the strain of such a system. Every law must be spoken at least once every 3 years, or risk fading from collective awareness. Every judgment relies on someone remembering accurately, or at least convincingly. Yet this fragility is also strength. Law remains alive, adaptable, evolving with each retelling. As night falls over Thingvellir, you picture fires glowing across the plain, each camp alive with recitations. Chieftains remind their followers of laws they might need, farmers rehearse rules about land or livestock, and children overhear fragments they'll remember years later. It's less like reading a statute book, and more like listening to an endless podcast of rules, replayed until the words sink deep. Walking between camps, you feel the paradox. Iceland ran not on ink and parchment, but on voices, breaths, and memory. In that fragile medium, entire communities place their trust. The campfires burn low, but the voices never stop. Everywhere you walk among the tents at Thingvellir, you hear murmurs of law, recited like half-remembered songs. The Lawspeaker may be the centerpiece, but memory here is a communal skill, sharpened with tricks that turn dry rules into something the tongue and ear can hold. Tonight you notice the tools of recall, the rhythms, the rhymes, these strange poetic devices that made Iceland's law portable in human heads. One mainstream fact: much of medieval Icelandic law was phrased in formulaic, almost poetic patterns. Repetition, alliteration, and rhythm were deliberately used to make passages easier to memorize. Just as sagas were shaped for oral performance, laws were crafted with the same musicality. The result was that justice often sounded like verse. You hear an example as two farmers argue near a fire. One chants, "If a man breaks the boundary fence, thrice shall he pay, and thrice shall he mend." The repetition makes it stick, the rhythm anchoring it in memory. His neighbor responds with another formula, each clause unfolding with a drumbeat of structure. Neither man is reciting from parchment, both are reciting from pattern. Quirky tidbit: some rules were remembered with almost comical phrasing. Penalties for sheep theft were wrapped in sing-song rhymes so that children could repeat them while herding, an accidental case of nursery rhymes doubling as criminal code. Imagine learning law not from textbooks but from ditties sung on a hillside. Historians still argue whether these poetic features were designed specifically for law, or whether Icelanders simply carried over techniques from their storytelling culture. Were laws dressed in rhythm to aid memory? Or did they naturally sound like sagas because sagas shaped every form of speech? Either way, the overlap kept the system alive. You pause by another camp where a young man repeats a clause after his elder, syllable by syllable. His voice falters, then steadies, like someone practicing scales on an instrument. This is legal training. Recitation by firelight, long winter nights filled with words instead of parchment. Memory becomes muscle, built by repetition. The methods vary. Some tap rhythm on their knees as they speak. Others close their eyes, letting sound carry them. A few arrange words into images, visualizing sheep, fences, rivers, and coins, so that the law unfolds as a mental landscape. These tricks, small and human, hold together the fabric of society. As you settle near one of the fires, you realize how strangely beautiful it is. The law isn't hidden in books. It lives in people's mouths. To remember is to govern. To recite is to make order real. and the entire system rests on something as fragile and as powerful as the human memory. The dawn breaks over Thingvellir, cool mist curling up from the streams, and the assembly stirs again. As you walk back toward the Law Rock, you realize that the act of speaking law isn't just administration, it's performance. To hear the Lawspeaker recite is to watch theater unfold, with the valley as the stage and the Icelandic people as the audience. Tonight, you lean in close to the performance of oral law, where justice sounds like poetry shouted to the cliffs. One mainstream fact: the Lawspeaker recited laws in public, not in private chambers. He would stand upon the Logberg and deliver his portion of the code aloud, in front of the chieftains and gathered people. This meant law wasn't a hidden archive, but a shared spectacle, as much entertainment as governance. The performance matters. His voice must carry across the valley, so he uses rhythm to give the words weight. Phrases fall in steady beats, allowing the crowd to catch each one. He gestures with his hand, as if conducting invisible music. The cliffs answer back faint echoes, turning his speech into a kind of call and response with the land itself. You stand there, chilled, realizing this wasn't just information, it was ceremony. Quirky tidbit. Some sources suggest that law speakers occasionally use dramatic pauses or repeated lines for emphasis, like actors milking applause. One even supposedly slipped in jokes, easing the tension by making the crowd laugh before launching back into sheep penalties and feud settlements. Imagine a stand-up comic whose set list is equal parts jokes and zoning ordinances. Historians still argue whether these recitations were delivered in exact legal prose or performed with embellishments. Did the Lawspeaker aim at precision, or was interpretation part of the act? Some scholars argue he served as both guardian and interpreter, using tone and gesture to guide meaning. Others insist fidelity was paramount, with artistry only helping memory. Either way, you can see how the law became inseparable from performance. Around you, the crowd participates. Some nod along, lips moving silently, rehearsing the words in parallel. Others react to familiar phrases with murmurs of approval, as if they're catching the chorus of a favorite song. The performance binds them together. They are not passive listeners, but co-rememberers, helping the law live in more than one mind. You notice how the children watch too, eyes wide, absorbing not just the words, but the rhythm, the authority, the sheer spectacle of one man commanding attention with nothing but his voice. For them, this is the classroom of law, no books, no parchment, just sound carving memory into the air. And here's where the awkwardness shows. Sometimes the Lawspeaker stumbles. He hesitates, backtracks, repeats a clause to set it right. The crowd shifts, waiting. No one jeers, too much rides on his accuracy, but you can feel the tension, the fragile moment when law itself teeters on the edge of forgetfulness. Then he steadies, resumes, and the relief washes through the people. You glance back at the Law Rock, seeing it not as cold stone, but as a stage that shaped Iceland's identity. Law wasn't hidden in dusty scrolls, whispered by clerks in private chambers. It was shouted to the sky, performed before the people, carried into memory by rhythm and voice. The performance ends. Silence lingers for a breath before conversations rise again, like applause after a concert. People turn back to their disputes, their feasting, their gossip. But the words remain in the air, hovering, ready to be recalled when needed. And as you leave the crowd, you realize you've just witnessed something rare. Law not as bureaucracy, but as living theater. Awkward at times, but unforgettable. In this society, justice was staged, and everyone was part of the audience. The festival hum never fully stops, but there are cracks in the rhythm, places where the grand machine of memory falters. You linger by a cluster of tents where voices rise, not in harmony but in irritation. Tonight you hear what happens when memory fails, when a law is forgotten, misstated, or bent just enough to spark confusion. One mainstream fact. Because Icelandic law was oral for its first centuries, it relied heavily on the accuracy of the Lawspeaker and the collective recall of chieftains. Yet no human memory is perfect. Discrepancies arose, sometimes sparking disputes that shaped outcomes as powerfully as the laws themselves. You overhear a farmer demanding justice. His neighbor's sheep wandered into his pasture, and he insists the law requires triple compensation. The neighbor argues back, no, the penalty is only double, and besides, the sheep strayed without malice. They both quote remembered phrases, voices sharpening as they clash. Soon, half a dozen onlookers chime in, each offering their own version, like a medieval legal subreddit where no one agrees on the citation. Quirky tidbit. There's a story of one law speaker who flat out admitted during a recitation that he'd forgotten a clause about inheritance. Instead of panicking, he waved it off and said the crowd should argue it out later. That single lapse became part of Icelandic lore, a reminder that even the living law book could suffer memory glitches. Historians still argue whether forgotten passages were quietly reinvented on the spot, or whether collective correction usually kept things accurate. Was law a collaborative recall effort, or did mistakes fossilize into new precedents? Some scholars see memory failure as the seed of legal evolution, others as dangerous cracks in the system. You picture the law speaker himself at such moments, sweat beading as he feels hundreds of eyes waiting for the right words. One slip and the balance of justice teeters. Did he stick to his memory stubbornly, even when others doubted? Or did he weave compromise into the gaps? The disputes ripple outward. You hear two men muttering, "My grandfather swore the law says one thing. My uncle insisted on another." Oral law doesn't just live in one voice. It sprawls across families and generations, each convinced their version is true. This makes every lawsuit feel like a saga duel, one clan's memory against another's. And sometimes improvisation filled the silence. A clever chieftain might argue that if no one could recall the exact clause, then his interpretation must stand until challenged. The law in such hands became clay, reshaped in the moment by memory's gaps. As night falls, the arguments soften into laughter. The sheep, oblivious, bleats in the distance. But you are left with unease. If law lives in memory, then forgetting is not just human, it's political. Justice here is fragile, always one lapse away from confusion. You pull your cloak tighter and realize, in Iceland, law was never carved in stone. It was spoken, remembered, occasionally misremembered, and that made it both alive and awkwardly vulnerable. The sheep bleats fade into the valley night, but disputes never really end. As you walk through the clusters of tents, you hear another kind of argument. Clans pitted against each other, each side armed not with swords, but with remembered lines of law. Tonight, you watch feuds unfold as if they were bardic duels, memory becoming the sharpest weapon of all. One mainstream fact: Iceland in the Commonwealth era, roughly 930–1262, was notorious for blood feuds between families. The law aimed to channel vengeance into compensation, preventing endless cycles of violence. But because the law was oral, each side leaned heavily on memory, quoting passages like warriors wielding spears. You pause at a heated circle. Two chieftains stand across from each other, cloaks snapping in the wind. One recites, "If a man strikes another within his home, thrice the fine shall he pay." His rival answers immediately, "Nay, it is twice the fine unless the door be broken, in which case thrice." Their followers nod, some murmuring agreement, others smirking at the supposed mistake. It feels less like a courtroom and more like a saga duel, each side flexing verbal muscle. Quirky tidbit: some disputes were so elaborate that people hired poets, skalds, to recite the laws on their behalf, turning trials into performances. Imagine today's lawyers arriving in court with rhymed arguments delivered in booming verse. Awkward? Maybe. Effective? Definitely. Historians still argue whether these feuds showed the strength or weakness of oral law. Some say the very act of arguing kept memory sharp, forcing society to rehearse its rules under pressure. Others believe the constant disputes reveal the fragility of law when nothing is written. Was it vibrant oral tradition, or shaky ground for justice? You notice how the crowd participates. A gray-haired farmer mutters his version of the law to his grandson, coaching him for the future. Women in woolen shawls trade whispered interpretations, shaping memory within households. Children listen, half bored, half absorbing the rhythms they'll repeat as adults. Everyone becomes a witness, a participant in the duel of words. The feud escalates, but instead of weapons, the chieftains keep circling back to remembered phrases. At last, the law speaker steps in, raising his hand. His voice cuts through the noise, delivering his authoritative recitation. The decision isn't just arbitration, it's performance, his memory outweighing all others. The crowd nods, some grudging, some relieved. As the rivals retreat, you sense that feuds in Iceland were not just battles of strength, but battles of memory. Victory depended as much on what you could recall and how well you could phrase it as on the size of your following. In a land where the written word had little sway, the spoken word was sharper than steel. The tension from the feud fades, replaced by the hum of everyday chatter. You wander among the tents and notice something curious. Bits of parchment here, a monk's scratchy handwriting there. For a land where memory rules supreme, you begin to see faint signs of writing creeping in, like the first moss on bare rock. Tonight you glimpse the slow arrival of scribes, where words begin to leave tongues and settle uneasily onto vellum. One mainstream fact: writing arrived in Iceland with Christianity around the year 1000. Monks brought Latin letters, copying scripture and prayers. But legal codes remained stubbornly oral for generations. It wasn't until the 12th and 13th centuries that laws began to be systematically written, most famously in Gragas, the Grey Goose Laws. Before then, memory was still king. You step into a monk's small tent at the edge of the assembly. Inside, the smell of ink mingles with sheep tallow candles. A young man bends over calfskin parchment, carefully scratching letters, his quill squeaking faintly. He isn't writing laws yet, he's copying hymns, but the skill itself feels like a quiet revolution. His fingers are stained black, his posture hunched, but his face glows with concentration. Quirky tidbit: vellum was so costly that some scribes reused pages, scraping off earlier texts to make space for new words. Imagine legal codes written on top of old psalms, faint ghost letters haunting the margins. Memory may be fragile, but parchment was expensive. Historians still argue whether Icelanders resisted writing law out of practicality or pride. Some believe it was simply too costly and slow. Others argue the oral tradition was valued as more flexible and communal, resistant to the rigidity of ink. Was writing an upgrade or a betrayal of tradition? As you leave the monk's tent, you see how writing coexists awkwardly with memory. A chieftain scoffs at the notion of laws on calfskin. Better to trust the tongue than the page. Parchment burns, ink fades, but memory lives. Yet another chieftain looks thoughtful, perhaps imagining disputes easier to settle with written evidence. The tension between old and new hangs in the summer air. Still, for now, memory dominates. The crowd gathers once more at the Law Rock, their ears open, their mouths ready to repeat. The quills scratch quietly in the margins, unnoticed by most. You sense the irony. Iceland's greatest treasure, its laws, remains spoken, even as writing slowly sharpens its quills in the shadows. The scratching of quills lingers faintly in your ears, but the sound is quickly drowned out by something livelier: laughter. You follow the noise through the crowd, past traders hawking cloth and children chasing each other through the grass, until you stumble upon a group reciting penalties. Tonight, you hear the strangest part of oral law: the punishments, quirky and specific, remembered as much for their oddity as for their justice. One mainstream fact: Gragas, when eventually written, preserved many of these punishments, revealing how Icelanders handled crimes in their oral law days. Fines were the most common sentence, measured in ounces of silver, livestock, or goods. Execution was rare. Exile, called skogangur, or going to the forest, was the harshest penalty. Yet before the laws were written, all these punishments lived only in people's memories, chanted like verses at the Althing. A farmer chants, "If a man calls another a thief without proof, 3 marks of silver he must pay." His neighbor laughs, counters with, "If a man strikes with fist, 1 ounce, if with weapon, 3 ounces. The rhythm of the lines makes them easy to recall and easy to parody. The crowd chuckles, repeating the phrases as though they were riddles at a feast. Quirky tidbit: one punishment for theft involved leading the guilty man to a crossroads and declaring his crime aloud so that shame would follow him everywhere. The act was part memory, part theater. Everyone who heard it became a living record of his disgrace. Imagine your entire neighborhood remembering your shoplifting incident forever because they literally turned it into a chant. Historians still argue whether the memorized penalties were truly consistent across generations or whether local communities bent them to suit their needs. Some scholars suggest Lawspeakers kept the backbone intact, but details like amounts of silver or conditions for exile may have drifted like folklore. Was law a fixed melody, or did each generation add its own verse? You watch another punishment recited. For sheep theft, fines could be doubled or tripled depending on whether the sheep was hidden or killed. The irony isn't lost on the crowd. Sheep are everywhere in Iceland, wandering through valleys as though the island belongs to them. One wag mutters, "If every sheep crime were punished, we'd all be exiled by winter." Laughter ripples again, and the seriousness of justice is softened by humor. The Lawspeaker, when he recites punishments from the Law Rock, sounds solemn. But here among the tents, the rules are chewed like tough bread and flavored with jokes. This duality keeps them alive. The memory of law isn't sterile, it's sticky, funny, even embarrassing. People remember not just the rule, but the laughter that went with it. As night falls, you sit by a fire where young men test each other, tossing out penalties like riddles. "What if a man insults another's beard?" one asks. "Fine of 3 ounces, another replies confidently. "What if he insults his mother?" The group roars, half in shock, half in glee. These mock trials are part game, part education, embedding law into memory through play. You realize that in Iceland, even punishments were woven into culture like songs. Fines weren't only financial, they were stories, carried from ear to ear. The awkwardness, the humor, the odd specificity, all these made the law unforgettable. And perhaps that was the point. The fire crackles low, voices soften, and you feel a shift in the air, away from laughter towards something heavier. As the crowd settles, you catch sight of the Lawspeaker again, his cloak drawn close against the chill. Tonight you step into the weight of his burden, the lonely pressure of being the single living archive of Icelandic justice. One mainstream fact: the Lawspeaker, or lögsögumaður, was elected for 3 years and held unique responsibilities. He presided over the Althing, recited 1/3 of the law each summer, and guided disputes by declaring the law aloud. Though chieftains wielded political power, the Lawspeaker held memory itself, and with it, enormous influence. You imagine his mind heavy with hundreds of clauses. Fines for theft, rules about grazing, details of inheritance, all must be stored neatly, ready to be spoken at will. The law is not written in ink, but in the folds of his memory, and if he forgets, the nation stumbles. Quirky tidbit: one Lawspeaker, Thorgils Oddsson, was said to have been chosen for his booming voice rather than his intellect. People joked that it mattered less whether he was wise than whether his words carried across the valley. Imagine being hired as the human hard drive not for storage capacity, but for volume control. Historians still argue whether Lawspeakers truly memorized the entire code or relied on communal correction. Some scholars insist they were walking libraries, trained from youth to hold every clause. Others suggest they functioned more like moderators, reciting the most essential parts while leaning on the crowd's shared recall for finer points. Was one man truly the vault, or just the key to unlocking everyone else's memory? You see him standing on the Law Rock again, eyes scanning the crowd. Behind his calm posture lies exhaustion. Imagine the anxiety. Forgetting a clause might not just embarrass him, it could tilt the outcome of a feud, alter the course of a family's fortune, even shift the balance of society. The weight of justice rests not on scrolls, but on his tongue. At night, perhaps he lies awake in his tent, rehearsing silently. His lips form words like prayers, repeating fines, penalties, rituals of inheritance. A slip of memory could undo years of trust. No wonder his role was both respected and feared. Around the campfires, people whisper his name with reverence and suspicion. Some call him the guardian of order, others a dangerous bottleneck. If he is biased, or if his memory falters, who can challenge him? You sense the fragile dance. Respect for the man who carries the law, yet constant watchfulness lest he misuse his power. The burden grows heavier with age. As years pass, he must keep track of changes, amendments spoken at assemblies, precedents set in disputes. The law is not static, it shifts, and so must his memory. Each summer he climbs the Law Rock again, each year the crowd watching closely, trusting him to carry Iceland's fragile archive forward. And as you look at him silhouetted against the setting sun, you understand. The Lawspeaker is not just a man. He is Iceland's memory, fragile and human. But for centuries, he kept the nation alive. The sun slips lower and the chill of the valley deepens. Fires are lit once more, and you wander between them until you hear a soft chorus of voices. Not the booming proclamation of the Lawspeaker, but the steady murmur of practice. Tonight you step into the world of apprentices, those who learned the law by firelight, trained not with parchment but with memory drilled into their tongues. One mainstream fact: Icelandic boys, particularly those from chieftain families, were expected to learn portions of the law by heart from a young age. They listened to elders at gatherings, practiced recitation in halls, and repeated key clauses until they could call them up without hesitation. This was not just education, it was survival in a society where forgetting could cost land, honor, or even life. You crouch beside one such group. A gray-bearded man chants slowly, "If a man wounds another, compensation is set at..." His apprentice repeats it, stumbling over the numbers. Again the elder chants. Again the youth repeats, until the words stick. It sounds less like study and more like a song, rhythm pressing the rules into memory. Quirky tidbit: some families used winter nights for law drills, turning the long darkness into classroom time. In sagas, there are references to young men bragging not about swordplay, but about how many laws they could recite without faltering. Imagine boasting at a feast that you've memorized the entire section on grazing rights. It doesn't sound thrilling now, but back then, it was a flex. Historians still argue whether this oral training was widespread or mostly limited to elite households. Did every farmer's son memorize the law, or only those destined for leadership? Some scholars see law as communal, recited by all. Others believe it was the special knowledge of a trained minority. The evidence remains frustratingly murky. You notice how the apprentices use tricks. One taps his foot in rhythm with each clause, the steady beat anchoring the words. Another closes his eyes, picturing sheep, fences, rivers, and silver coins as a mental map of the law. Another mutters quietly while carving notches into a piece of driftwood, each cut a reminder of a line. Oral culture is inventive. Every mind finds its own way to hold the fragile cargo of memory. As you watch, the scene feels intimate. Families gathered in smoky halls, firelight flickering, the air thick with the smell of fish stew and damp wool. While storms rage outside, voices inside repeat and repeat, forging the next generation of living libraries. The atmosphere is both domestic and monumental, bedtime stories mixed with the scaffolding of law. And so you realize that in Iceland, education was not hidden in books or cloisters. It was spoken in kitchens, drilled beside fires, whispered into the ears of children half asleep under sheepskin blankets. Law was not distant. It was sung into the bones of every household, one voice at a time. The voices of the apprentices fade behind you, but their rhythm lingers. As you walk on, you notice another gathering. A skald, cloak pulled tight against the chill, reciting a saga to a crowd. The listeners laugh, gasp, and nod at familiar names. And you realize law and saga share the same roots. Tonight, you explore how medieval Icelanders wove their rules into stories, embedding memory inside narrative. One mainstream fact: the Icelandic sagas, though written down later, preserve elements of oral tradition. These tales of family feuds, heroic deeds, and awkward sheep disputes often smuggled in pieces of law. Rules about inheritance, penalties, or procedures appear naturally in the flow of storytelling, making the law easier to recall because it rode alongside drama. You hear it clearly in the saga unfolding by the fire. The skald chants of a quarrel between two brothers over land. Soon a line emerges. By law, no man may seize boundary stones in secret. He must summon witnesses before moving them. The crowd nods, half entertained, half reminded of the rule. For them, the saga is both story and statute book. Quirky tidbit: in some households, storytellers deliberately slipped in test clauses, pretending to recount a saga, but actually drilling young listeners with law disguised as plot. Imagine tricking children into learning tax codes by hiding them inside bedtime adventures. It sounds devious, but it worked. Historians still argue whether sagas were primarily entertainment or education. Were they crafted for leisure, with law as incidental seasoning? Or were they vehicles of memory, designed to ensure rules survived across generations? The debate continues, but either way, the sagas carried law forward, like hidden cargo in their narrative hulls. You lean closer to the fire. The skald's voice rises and falls, weaving tension and release. The audience is rapt, but you notice how their ears perk at every legal clause. A farmer shifts, murmuring agreement when land rights are recited. A woman whispers a reminder to her daughter when marriage contracts are invoked. The saga is entertainment, but it also refreshes law in every mind present. The overlap feels seamless. Just as laws were shaped with rhythm and repetition, sagas were shaped with formulaic phrases and stock scenes. The two forms blended easily, so much so that modern scholars sometimes struggle to separate history from law in these texts. You picture a long winter hall, smoke curling toward rafters, the storm rattling outside. A skald recites, weaving humor, feud, tragedy, and rule into one tapestry. Children doze at the edges, half asleep but still absorbing the rhythms. By morning, they remember not just the heroes, but the law tucked inside their deeds. And so you realize, in Iceland, law did not sit apart from story. It was story. Every clause had a tale, every tale a clause. Memory clung to narrative, and in that fusion, justice survived the centuries. The skald's voice trails away, replaced by the steady crackle of torches and the murmur of the crowd. But you sense a hush falling as another kind of recitation begins, one tinged with reverence rather than amusement. Tonight, you step into the sacred aura of memory itself, where speaking the law feels less like governance and more like ritual, as though the words were a kind of spell. One mainstream fact: Icelanders treated the act of reciting the law at the Althing as a sacred duty. The Lawspeaker's words weren't just information, they were binding truth, believed to carry the authority of both tradition and the divine. In a land with no written constitution, memory itself had to bear the weight of sanctity. You picture the Lawspeaker on the law rock, his hand lifted, the crowd hushed. Each phrase falls into the valley with deliberate weight, almost like a chant. The cadence is slow, solemn, and rhythmic, as though the words themselves are holy relics being displayed. You feel it in the silence of the listeners. The reverence is unmistakable. Quirky tidbit: some sources hint that people treated slips of memory like omens. If the Lawspeaker faltered mid-clause, some saw it as a sign of divine displeasure, as though the gods had tugged the words away. Imagine forgetting your lines at a school play, only to have the audience gasp that fate itself had just spoken through your stumble. Historians still argue whether this aura of sanctity was truly religious or more symbolic. Was the law seen as divine command, or simply as ancestral authority too important to question? Some scholars lean toward ritualized religion. Others suggest the solemnity was political theater, designed to strengthen obedience. Either way, the act carried spiritual weight. You watch the crowd lean forward, eyes fixed on the Lawspeaker. Each clause feels carved in air, not stone, yet no less permanent for its fragility. Farmers cross themselves as they listen, a gesture half pagan, half Christian. Children are hushed. Even the satyrs of gossip fall silent. In this moment, words are not just sounds. They are law incarnate. And beyond the law rock, the same reverence trickles into households. Families gathered in long halls often treated legal recitations as if they were blessings, repeating them before meals or at the close of feasts. Law was not a dusty set of rules hidden in scrolls. It was a living chant, a sacred memory woven into daily life. As the Lawspeaker finishes, silence hangs a beat longer before voices resume. You realize that in Iceland, memory was not just practical, it was holy. To speak law aloud was to sanctify it, to bind society together through rhythm and reverence, breath and belief. The crowd drifts back toward their tents, still murmuring fragments of the Lawspeaker's chant. But as you walk among them, you notice something easily overlooked. Women repeating the words to their children, wives correcting their husbands' slips, grandmothers reminding families of rules tied to land and inheritance. Tonight you discover the quieter half of Iceland's legal memory, how women preserved the law in households and storytelling, even though they held no official role at the Althing. One mainstream fact: although only men held chieftaincies or spoke at the law rock, women in Icelandic society were deeply involved in passing down knowledge. The sagas often show mothers, wives, and widows counseling men in disputes, quoting law or recalling precedent. Memory was not confined to the Althing, it thrived in kitchens and longhouses. You picture a farmstead in winter. Snow presses against the turf walls, the fire crackles in the hearth, and inside, a mother tells her children a saga that doubles as a legal lesson. She slips in a reminder about dowries, about the penalties for insults, about what must be witnessed for a marriage to stand. Her daughters memorize as much as her sons, all absorbing the law as naturally as lullabies. Quirky tidbit: One saga tells of a woman reciting laws more accurately than her husband during a feud, shaming him into silence. Her quick tongue preserved her family's honor, while his faulty memory nearly cost them land. Imagine being roasted at dinner, not for forgetting your anniversary, but for botching inheritance law in front of the neighbors. Historians still argue whether women's role in oral law was widely recognized or only hinted at in sagas. Were they active participants in preserving rules? Or did they act behind the scenes, their contributions hidden by male-dominated assemblies? The debate continues, but evidence suggests women carried significant legal knowledge, especially in matters of marriage, property, and family. As you walk, you see how women's memory acted like a parallel archive. While men thundered clauses at the law rock, women wove them into domestic life. They reminded husbands of the right number of witnesses, coached sons on how to phrase claims, and taught daughters what to demand in marriage contracts. Their voices may not have echoed across Thingvellir, but they shaped the way laws lived in daily practice. The balance is striking. In public, the law was a masculine performance, booming and theatrical. In private, it was a feminine whisper, steady and practical. Together, they formed the full circle of Icelandic memory, the shouted chant and the quiet reminder, the official recital and the fireside correction. And so you realize that without women, the law might have faded between assemblies. Their voices preserved what parchment could not yet hold, ensuring memory was not only performed, but also nurtured in the warmth of households. The night grows still, but the Althing never truly quiets. Traders whisper, children laugh in their sleep, and fires pop in the cold air. You drift toward the edge of the gathering, where a group of foreign travelers huddle together, cloaks pulled tight. Their accents mark them as outsiders, merchants from Norway perhaps, or envoys from the British Isles, and you catch the look of astonishment on their faces. Tonight you see Iceland's oral law through the bewildered eyes of strangers. One mainstream fact: Iceland's reliance on oral law was unusual in medieval Europe. Other societies were already relying heavily on written charters, codices, and clerical records. Visitors to Iceland often remarked on how strange it was that an entire nation governed itself without scrolls or permanent documents. You overhear one merchant muttering, "They run a parliament with no book, no parchment, no record, only a man shouting on a rock." His companion shakes his head in disbelief, convinced it's a recipe for chaos. To them, the absence of written law feels reckless, even primitive. Yet they cannot deny that Iceland is functioning, its markets bustling, its disputes settled, its society intact. Quirky tidbit: one story claims that a visiting priest tried to write down an Icelandic law as it was spoken, only to be laughed at. Locals teased him that paper might rot or burn, while memory, passed on through many mouths, would endure as long as people lived. Imagine being scolded for cheating by taking notes in the middle of class. Historians still argue whether Iceland's oral system made it seem backward to outsiders or oddly admirable. Some visitors may have mocked it as unsophisticated. Others likely marveled at the discipline required. Was it a sign of cultural deficiency or cultural strength? Opinions, then as now, are divided. You imagine the bewilderment of foreign envoys used to libraries and scribes. They walk through Thingvellir, watching barefoot farmers debate fines with precision, or children quoting penalties for insults. To them, it looks like sorcery. How can so much law exist without ink? Some even suspect divine aid, as though the Lawspeaker must be blessed with supernatural recall. And yet, as they linger, they see how natural it is. Memory here is not a trick, but a way of life. The law is not stored in books because it doesn't need to be. It is stored in people, refreshed every summer in the open air. Outsiders gape in disbelief, but Icelanders shrug. It is simply how things are done. As the foreigners retreat to their tents, muttering about parchment and ink, you feel the irony. What they see as fragility is, for Icelanders, resilience. The awkwardness of memory as government confounds outsiders, but it has kept this island society alive. The murmurs of the puzzled foreigners fade into the night, but their questions linger. You walk on and find yourself among monks bent over tables, their candles flickering against calfskin parchment. At last, writing begins to creep into Iceland, slow and cautious, like frost spreading across a window pane. Tonight, you witness the slow creep of vellum, the moment when memory begins to share its burden with ink. One mainstream fact: By the 12th century, Icelandic clerics started recording laws systematically. The most famous collection is Gragas, the Grey Goose Laws, compiled in the 12th and 13th centuries. For the first time, Iceland's oral tradition hardened into manuscript form, written on vellum made from calfskin. You picture the scene. A monk dips his quill, scrapes it gently across the page, and whispers as he writes, "If a man wounds another, let compensation be." The words, once spoken to the open sky, now cling to parchment.
They lose their rhythm, their musicality, but gain permanence. The sound of memory is replaced by the scratch of quill. Quirky tidbit: vellum was so valuable that it sometimes came from calves, slaughtered specifically for writing. Each law manuscript might require an entire herd, turning livestock into libraries. Imagine explaining to your neighbor that your cow went not into stew, but into statute. Historians still argue whether the shift to writing strengthened or weakened the law. Some see manuscripts as a triumph of preservation, protecting the code from forgetfulness. Others argue that writing stripped law of its flexibility, freezing what had once been alive. Was vellum a safeguard or a coffin? You feel the tension in the air. Chieftains mutter that writing may put too much power in the hands of scribes, turning law into a private possession rather than a shared memory. Farmers worry that manuscripts, locked away in churches, will exclude ordinary voices. And yet younger men lean forward eagerly, sensing opportunity in the written word. The Lawspeaker, too, feels the pressure. His role is no longer singular. A manuscript might one day outlive him, his booming voice replaced by silent pages. You imagine his unease, to be a living library in a world suddenly building shelves. Still, the memory culture doesn't vanish overnight. For decades, the two systems overlap. The Lawspeaker recites as always, while monks scratch by candlelight. The crowd listens to rhythm and rhyme, while clerics pore over pages. Oral and written law coexist, each suspicious of the other, yet bound together by necessity. And as you watch a monk gently close his parchment, blowing out his candle, you realize something. Vellum may record the law, but it cannot replace the feeling of hundreds of voices murmuring it together. Memory and manuscript are no longer enemies. They are uneasy companions, shaping the next chapter of Iceland's story. The monk's candle sputters out, but the debate his parchment stirs burns brightly across the valley. You wander closer to the law rock and hear raised voices. Not from feuds over sheep or insults this time, but over the very soul of the law. Tonight, you step into the tension of memory versus manuscript, as Icelanders argue whether ink strengthens or weakens their fragile system. One mainstream fact: by the 13th century, Icelanders were divided on the use of written law. Some embraced manuscripts like Gragas as reliable anchors, while others resisted, fearing that written codes would lock rules in place and strip them of their oral flexibility. The Althing itself wrestled with how much authority manuscripts should hold compared to spoken recitation. You hear a chieftain boom, "A written page cannot correct itself when found false. But a man may speak again and set his words aright." His rival counters, "A page does not forget, nor does it lie. It does not bend to a man's mood. It holds the law firm." Around them, the crowd murmurs, half swayed by tradition, half by innovation. Quirky tidbit: one saga claims that a chieftain deliberately misread from a manuscript to favor his allies, pretending the ink said what his tongue wished. The audience, unused to questioning writing, accepted it. It turns out parchment could lie just as easily as memory, only in a different accent. Historians still argue whether manuscripts truly democratized law by fixing it in visible form, or whether they centralized power by making literacy a gatekeeper. Did writing spread knowledge to more people, or narrow it to scribes and clerics? Scholars remain divided, seeing both preservation and exclusion in the same pages. You imagine the Lawspeaker caught in the middle. For generations, his voice was the law's heartbeat. Now a silent page threatens to upstage him. Does he cling to tradition, trusting memory's flexibility? Or does he concede that his voice, however strong, cannot outlast ink? Perhaps he finds balance, reciting still but leaning on manuscripts as a crutch for what slips away. The crowd reflects the divide. Farmers, used to hearing law aloud, mutter uneasily about ink they cannot read. Young men, curious about books, lean closer to monks for lessons. Women continue teaching law by story at home, undisturbed by the squabble. The law itself seems to shimmer between two worlds, fluid and sung, fixed and written. As the debate stretches long into the night, you realize it isn't only about law, it's about identity. To give up oral tradition feels like losing part of Iceland's soul. To embrace writing feels like entering a larger, sharper world. And so the island teeters, its memory and its manuscripts locked in an awkward duet, each insisting it is the truest voice of justice. The arguments over memory and manuscript echo in the night air, but your path leads you toward a quieter space, one where law has already transformed into something else. Around another fire, a skald leans forward, voice low, drawing his audience close. He isn't reciting fines or punishments. He is telling a saga, and woven into it are the faint echoes of legal codes now blurred into legend. Tonight you trace the legacy of oral law in the sagas themselves, those great Icelandic stories that outlived the system which birthed them. One mainstream fact: the Icelandic sagas, written mainly in the 13th and 14th centuries, were shaped by the oral culture that preceded them. Their structure, formulaic phrases, repeated motifs, careful attention to disputes and inheritance, echoes the rhythms of spoken law. Though the sagas are literature, they carry the DNA of legal memory within them. You hear it in the skald's tale. Two families argue over land at a river bend. Witnesses are called, dowries are recalled, insults are weighed as though they were silver. The story moves like a legal case, each step rehearsed, each phrase sharpened for memorability. The crowd listens intently, not just for the drama, but for the lesson beneath it. Quirky tidbit. One saga describes a man reciting so much law during a dispute that his opponent fell asleep mid-argument. It was less a duel of blades than of boredom, the victory going to whichever side could outlast the other's recitation. Imagine losing your land not because of violence, but because you couldn't stay awake through the legal monologue. Historians still argue whether sagas were meant as entertainment first, or whether they doubled as practical guides to law. Some scholars suggest they were cautionary tales, teaching listeners how disputes unfolded under Icelandic rules. Others see law as incidental, woven in naturally because it was part of daily life. Either way, sagas preserved oral law long after memory gave way to parchment. You look around the fire and see how deeply these tales penetrate. Children lean forward, mouths open. Farmers nod, recognizing phrases they've heard at the Althing. Women murmur reminders to one another, as if the saga has sparked memories of household duties or contracts. The law is no longer recited formally, but its spirit lives in these narratives, stitched into the rhythms of story. The sagas immortalize the tension between memory and permanence. They are written, yes, but they sound like something spoken. Even on parchment, they keep the cadence of oral law, echoing the voices that once rang out from the law rock. And so they bridge worlds. Neither holy memory nor holy manuscript, but something in between. As the skald finishes, silence hangs for a heartbeat before the audience exhales, murmuring their approval. You realize that even if oral law fades, its pulse continues in saga form. Law becomes legend, legend becomes literature, and memory survives disguised as story. The skald's voice fades, the fire burns low, and you realize you've nearly reached the end of Iceland's long experiment with memory as law. Around you, the camp's quiet, and the valley lies hushed beneath the stars. Tonight, you witness the fading echoes, the final years of the Lawspeakers, the last time law lived only in voices before parchment claimed the task for good. One mainstream fact: by the mid-13th century, written codes such as Gragas took firm hold, and the role of the Lawspeaker diminished. By the time Iceland fell under Norwegian rule in 1262, oral law was no longer the sole authority. The great age of memory as constitution had ended. You imagine a weary Lawspeaker in his final years, standing once more on the law rock. His voice is still strong, but fewer ears lean forward. More eyes turn toward the manuscripts carried by clerics. His memory, once the backbone of the nation, is becoming ceremonial, almost nostalgic. He speaks, but parchment waits to confirm him. Quirky tidbit. One tale says that a later Lawspeaker, realizing his role was fading, deliberately exaggerated his recitations with jokes and flourishes as if to remind the crowd of the old magic. It didn't save the oral system, but it made his audience laugh, leaving memory behind with humor rather than silence. Historians still argue whether the end of oral law was mourned or welcomed. Did Icelanders feel relief that parchment gave stability, or sorrow that the living voice was being silenced? Some records suggest nostalgia for the grandeur of the Lawspeaker's performance. Others show eagerness for the clarity of writing. The truth, perhaps, is that both feelings lived side by side. You walk away from Thingvellir one last time. The Law Rock stands silent now, no voice booming across the valley, no rhythm binding the people. Yet you sense the echoes, centuries of recitation still clinging to the stone like breath frozen into the cliffs.
Though parchment has taken over, memory has not vanished. It lingers in sagas, in families, in the cadence of Icelandic speech itself. And you realize the lesson is oddly soothing. Memory may fade, but it never disappears entirely. The voices of the past keep whispering, even if quieter now, reminding you that the fragile human mind once carried the weight of a whole nation. The fires are out now, the camps are dark, and the Law Rock stands silent under the cold stars. You no longer hear the chants of the Lawspeaker or the murmurs of apprentices practicing their clauses. The valley is still, waiting, as if the voices have finally gone to sleep. You settle into the quiet, the echo of words still drifting in your thoughts. Imagine the laws, once carried on human breath, now softened into memory like lullabies. No parchment, no ink, just the faint impression of rhythm and story, as if the land itself remembers. Your body feels heavy, the way vellum must have felt under the weight of ink. Yet unlike parchment, you don't need to preserve anything tonight. You can let the rules fade, the disputes drift, the feuds dissolve into silence. You don't need to remember every clause, because the story has already done the work for you. Let the cadence slow. The recitations have ended. The voices are gone. What's left is only calm, the soft rhythm of your own breathing, steady as a monk's pen across vellum. Think of the valley, empty now, but holding the memory of centuries. Think of the cliffs, still echoing faintly with words spoken so long ago. Think of the way law itself can fade into story, and story into peace. And now allow your eyes to grow heavy, as though you too are laying down a burden of memory. The night is here to hold you. The law has been spoken, the story finished, the silence restored. Sleep will come easily now.